Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another Swedenborgian Community Online book discussion. Today we are continuing where we left off a number of weeks ago, as you can tell maybe by my beard if you're watching this, on heaven and hell. And we're going to get through a decent amount of it, just like the first one. But I do want to say, some of our book discussions in the past, it's been more of a presentation style, and I want to ask more questions of you all and get you involved. So if you're expecting that, I've prepared a few more invitational queries, and also for you to just ponder on, and hopefully we can tackle one of Swedenborg's most popular books, Heaven and Hell, together. And I'm happy to be connected with you all today, and let's just get started. So, Swedenborg said that he was awake during all of the visions that led to this book. That, in fact, he was awake in his body, and he had his inner sight opened, and that's how he saw all these crazy things in heaven, hell, and the spiritual realm. We talked quite a bit about some of the details of heaven in the first video, and I've been really happy to see your feedback on YouTube about, and in my inbox about the discussion. You all seem to like it, but what's your opinion? I mean, who is Swedenborg? 18th century mystic, once a scientist. Why do we care about what he had to say? I'm curious about what you believe, and if you believe in an afterlife, and what are the details of it? Do you believe in hell? Many people don't. And do you buy any of Swedenborg's visioning? Moreover, so he starts this section of the book in 154 on how the state of angels or people in heaven change. And he says, angels change in regard to their love and their faith and their wisdom and intelligence in the next life. So they continue to learn, their hearts continue to change, and their life continues to evolve and spiral through its ups and downs, but continuously closer and closer to the Lady, to the Lord. For example, their love can actually decrease gradually within its own kind of spiral state to its least intensity sometimes, but also increase to its most intensity, and that correlates to cooling and warming of like the day, of the weather of our lives in the spiritual realm. And although there is no corollary to night in heaven, Swedenborg says, there is a corollary to half-light, just before the dawn. I find that fascinating that there's no night, but I guess that's what we're told in Revelation, that there will be no night with the New Jerusalem at least, which may or may not be heaven in our interpretations of biblical scripture. And also, he says that as their lives change, the states of things around them change too, like their environment literally shifts based on their hearts changing, their wisdom changing. Do you all think that would be trippy or just astounding? How do you think that would go for you? What kind of objects could be in your around you? I know some people who may say horses or dogs or cats. I'm curious, what do you think that type of environment, what would the impact be if things change based on your heart changing? And as they continue to grow and increase their love and wisdom over time, they increase their joy and connection with each other over time as well. And part of the reason people continue to change in the heavenly realm and also in hell, I guess, is because things would pale otherwise. We're designed to continue to grow and to want to continue to grow. And angels, they still have a sense of self, like we do, which involves loving themselves and enjoying heaven's bliss to the degree that they can actually be kept from their sense of self, according to Swedenborg, and focusing on love of community, love of God's qualities and God, Him or herself. And there's an oscillation between these states, in a sense, these internal states that allow them to reorient and change and to grow over time. And in fact, Swedenborg says that the oscillation between a selfish orientation and being more oriented towards other people is what allows people and angels, who are people and aliens in heaven, according to Swedenborg, to be made more perfect throughout this process, to eternity, actually. So, to you, what is the sense of self that is necessary? Why is that necessary for oscillation? What is it, and why? Do you believe that? Do you really think that that's something we have to be kept from to accept heaven? I know some people may disagree with that idea. So Swedenborg says, quote, "When angels are involved in their sense of self, they begin to feel depressed. They are kept saying though that they lived in hope that they would soon return to their earlier state and be in heaven again, so to speak." So they're in heaven, but so to speak, be in heaven again, since heaven for them is being kept free from their sense of self, according to Swedenborg. So I'm kind of amazed that depression could be in heaven. I don't really know about that. What do you all think about that? Later he talks about depression in human beings on this planet, and he says that it's from our connections with spirits that are more selfish and hellish, and those before they go into hell, before they're really accepting hell. And so the way he describes it later, it makes me think that maybe he's talking about something else in these angels. It's a relative depression. I mean, he does talk a lot about the relativity of all these states. Angels who are more in love and open to God's qualities, their worst state, in a sense, is better than angels who are much less so. He wrote in Latin, and I don't know Latin, so I didn't check it, but I'm curious as to what he actually means there. Angels also say that the Lord doesn't produce these changes of state in them, but that they are the cause when they are misled by their selfishness. And the Lord continues to draw them near, much like the sun in our solar system, and the oscillation of heat and cold that are caused by the objects in relation to it, in their relative position and exposure, but not the sun itself. And of course, Swedenborg said that the Lord actually appears as a sun in heaven, and changes depending on the angels, and the appearance changes depending on the angel's state, from its color to its position in their lives, because all of the representations of the next life actually correspond to our connection with each other and our connection to God. So who else finds it fascinating that the Lord appears as a sun? I know we don't have many in our Chatsy this evening, partly I think because most of the time this is kind of like a review or lecture, and I'll try to incorporate maybe more topical talks in the future. But no, I'm curious of your opinion on this. And what else have you found fascinating about this book? It's a lot to read too. We're getting through a quarter of the book every single session. But just watching these videos, whether or not you've read them, I try to hit the most important parts and kind of summarize the themes of each chapter. So you don't actually have to have read it to participate. Just listen and reflect. And he also says changes of state occur with those in hell, as we mentioned, but he wants to talk more about that later. The next section is called Time in Heaven. And although things happen in heaven in sequence, he says, there is no time in the way that we would think of it in the material realm. Angels don't have any notion of time and space in heaven. In this chapter, he focuses on time only. Alyssa in our chat says she cares about what he has to say because it was the first description of heaven and hell that she could begin to understand and appreciate. That's nice. There aren't the hellfire and brimstones versus glowing kingdom with lost splendor of spaces that she was taught when she was a youth. That you're just condemned to hell because you're in another religion. I know you've said in the past. And Swedenborg instead provides a glimpse of the spiritual world that is vast and varied, that reflects the diversity of humanity. Yeah, and we talk a lot about in the first video about that, the first podcast. But it's good to remember that Swedenborg's spiritual realm, his heaven, is ecumenical. It's various. Diversity actually leads to the perfection of heaven. Thank you for those thoughts, Alyssa. I appreciate it. And this is why this relation to time in heaven, which has to do with sequence of state, changes of state versus how the material world works and how astral bodies turn in fixed periods, days, years, which actually he says don't exist in heaven. This is why in Scripture all of the uses of time represent states or changes of them. So it's interesting. He says there's no fixed periods in heaven, but there are sequences of state. So there is a progress of heaven in connection with our material realm. And I'm curious, how that works. There's no time, but you'll see people change. It's fascinating. And spring and morning in the spiritual world are like love and wisdom in its first state, in its correspondential spiritual meaning. And winter turns into a concept of states characteristic to hell, because apparently there is not much of a winter in heaven. So I'm sorry for those who love your winter sports. Maybe you could visit hell. And he says, quote, by eternity, angels perceive an infinite state, not an infinite time, in 167. And Swedenborg was once in anxiety about what it means that God existed from eternity. I'm curious, are you ever anxious about a description of God? If you are, please share about, what are the details of that description that made you anxious? To him, it was this idea that God could come from eternity. Also because maybe he had an idea of the universe having a start point, whether it was, billions of years ago or what have you. And then Swedenborg says that he was raised into a sphere of heaven for more wisdom, to shed light on this idea for him. And he realized that he shouldn't think of this as a temporal thing, but in terms of state, that God is from an eternity of state, not an eternity of time in the sense that we would think of it. He also goes on to say that when angels speak to us, spiritual concepts turn into natural concepts in our minds often, such as state turning into notions of time. So often we can have insights from the heavenly realm, from the spiritual realm, but often they're turned into natural concepts for our understanding. And our thoughts are limited and constrained to the extent that we derive our thoughts from ideas of time and space and matter, and are expanded to the extent that they overcome these derivations as our mind is then raised above bodily and worldly considerations when we step away from the materialistic idea of time and space and think about it more in terms of our internal life and what it really means for people, the passing of time and in their spirit especially, and in relation to how they're changing and connecting with people. The next section is called Representations and Appearances in Heaven. And he says angels actually have senses. They have a body, they have nose, ears, eyes, spiritual bodies that they can see and feel, much like we can, except more exquisitely, apparently. And they have senses, too. And yes, their senses are more refined, more delicate than ours. He goes on to say that the things they see, besides the environments that we'll talk about later, are objects in heaven, are more perfect in form and more abundant than in this world, somehow. I guess we'll find out. It can only be seen by the eyes of our spirit. What kind of objects do you think you'd see in the spiritual world? And what would that mean that you're seeing an object? If it's not material, then where does it come from? And why does it exist? Maybe we'll find out. All the things in heaven come from the Lord in response to the deeper nature of angels. Angels do have both inner and outer natures, according to Swedenborg. But their outer natures are perfectly responsive to their inner, like a face that doesn't try to hide how it feels. And things in heaven are called representations because they are responsive to angels' deeper natures. They change around them because of their deeper natures, and so they're called representations. He also says they're called appearances, all the things in heaven, because they vary depending on the state of the people there. And although they appear as vividly and actually as objects in the material realm, they have this deeper meaning to them. And so you can pick them up, you can interact with them, they're very clear, but they have a meaning to them, not just the history of how it was formed, in a sense. And they do actually come into being because of this deep meaning, which is actually what's real for us humans. They're called appearances, and they're called real appearances. And he says there's also unreal appearances, but he'll cover that later. Who knows, maybe in the more hellish section of this book. An example of this phenomenon is that to angels focused on intelligence, gardens and parks appear, according to Swedenborg. Around them, in their homes, outside of them, in lovely designs, with arches and promenades even. And they're so beautiful as to defy speculation and description. These angels walk in and have activities in these gardens. They do things in heaven and even make garlands and stuff like that for babies and each other with the plants there. They can use the plants to create things. They also are clothed in heaven, according to this next section, 177. They have clothes on that correspond to their intelligence mainly, and but they also have connection to their affection, their heart, and they gleam or even are radiant, or is it flaming in heaven. So, in a lot of near-death experiences, as we've talked about in our near-death talks, the clothing is inflamed and bright of the angels people meet. In fact, a lot of times the angels themselves are said to be shining. And maybe it's the divine being itself that they're seeing. But it's interesting that there's such a high corollary here hundreds of years ago in this 18th century book by Emanuel Swedenborg. And he says, though, that the angels in the inmost heaven, this heaven oriented towards love, true, deep love of goodness, love of the Lord's qualities, are naked. They're not wearing clothes. And since angels' clothes correspond to their intelligence, they also correspond to truth, since intelligence comes from divine truth. Okay, so angels are naked, really? What do you think about that? What do you think about clothing corresponding to truth? Partly because it's the thing that outmost covers them, and intelligence and truth is kind of like a covering, something that you present to the world. But, wisdom, love, which can go deeper than what we can present in our intelligence and our truth, perhaps, is more within maybe their bodies and perhaps their environments as well. And their clothes flame or become radiant because goodness corresponds to flame, and light to what's true because of that goodness. So if their clothes are flaming, it's because they are oriented towards goodness, according to Swedenborg. And why angels' clothes appear gleaming or white in scriptures connected to this. So in scripture, often angels are talked about as having white clothing or gleaming or being radiant. And he says that this is why, because in the spiritual realm, that's what things look like. He also says this is why scripture often talks about not defiling your garments, walking in white and not dirting your clothes, and wearing a wedding garment even, are all related to this phenomena of in the spiritual realm of heaven. And also the Lord clothing Jerusalem in fine clothes, as described often in the Hebrew scriptures. It's because of this phenomenon. And also, as we'll talk about more, all the clothes are given to these angels gratis, like free from God, according to Swedenborg. And also weddings in scripture show up a lot, I should say, right? Weddings, the Lord being a bride, us being a bridegroom, the church being a bridegroom. And Swedenborg says this is because God is united with us in our truths and our intelligence and our love and affections. We'll talk more about that later. And to get back to the nakedness thing of the angels of the inmost heaven, Swedenborg says, I'm curious what you came up with there. Swedenborg says it's due to their innocence, that their innocence corresponds to being nude, being naked. And that's why they don't have clothes. So it doesn't mean they don't have intelligence, I guess, right? It's interesting, right? And we talk that way in our language. We say, "Oh, I'm naked now because I'm revealed," and often it's because we feel guilty about something. But the more innocent you are, the more kind of naked you become because you don't try to hide yourself. So it seems to fit there. What I find interesting in this next section of this reading is that angels can still take off their clothes. They can still store them, put them on others, put on other clothes that they have, not put them on other people, but put on other clothes that they have. And so they still wear a variety of clothes. So I guess maybe different clothes correspond to different parts of their intelligence, different nuances. I'm sure there's a lot going on up here in all of our lives and minds. So makes sense. And as I said, it's given to them. All this variety of clothing is given to them by God. So is heaven a socialist state? Curious about that. What do you think? Would you consider it that way? They do talk about people, angels in heaven working, but that work is to increase the joy in lives and to spread the joy of those in heaven, which can be done in art and doesn't have to be done by production in the same sense, to be valued there. Even just increasing other people's wisdom and insight and love is considered quite the gift in heaven. And so I think even their usefulness is different than our own. And they're given all these things, no matter how useful in kind of a tinkering, if they're a manager or not, way. I find that amazing. And their clothes do change depending on their changes of state. So even the clothes they have change somewhat, especially in regards to how dim or radiant they are over the course of their spiritual spiraling, their spiritual days. And as they grow, of course. People in the hells, however, wear dirty and foul clothes and rags, according to Swedenborg, fits with their insanity of evil. And they think it's normal there. So their clothes are, rags, torn, what have you, and all of their clothing, and including their body, which I think we talked about a little bit before, corresponds to the selfishness that they're unwilling to give up in the deepest part of their hearts that is their ruling affections. If they're unwilling to change, if they're just selfish, no matter what their tradition or non-tradition, if they continue to want to dominate people forever, well then they're forever in hell. They're forever connected to hell. The opportunity there is to change, but according to Swedenborg, once you're really kind of digging into hell, he hasn't seen people come out of there. So there you go. In the next life. In this life, I think we're given more opportunities and more leverage to change. Because as he describes later, we're kept in kind of an equilibrium state between heaven and hell, in connection with good and evil spirits that aren't quite ready for heaven and hell. And we'll talk more about that later. So what do you think about all that? Clothes in heaven. It's fascinating that they would say something about your mind, right? What kind of clothes would that be? Maybe someone can draw a picture for what they would think they would look like, or someone else would look like, with clothes that correspond to their intelligence. In terms of homes and houses, angels have homes, have dwelling places, homes, houses, depending on their society, community, which also vary depending on their state of life individually. And so just like clothes, just like their bodies. And the more splendid homes correspond to more humble and splendid spirits in the spiritual kingdom. So those who are more oriented towards the Lord and living that out and uplifting it in others are given homes that are more splendid. But buildings in the heavenly kingdom, which is actually the deeper heaven, the closest to God, according to Swedenborg, because unlike those in the spiritual kingdom that are oriented towards wisdom more, love of the neighbor more, those in the heavenly kingdom are oriented more towards love itself and goodness itself, which gives rise to wisdom and love of the neighbor and its truthiness and how it often plays out. And those homes in that kingdom are devoid of splendor and simple. And as we'll see, I think part of the reason why there's that difference is that the splendor of the homes in the spiritual kingdom, probably partly because it relates to what those people are used to, but also, that splendor helps to as a marker, because they need officials, they need people to help lead them, because they're still learning to be more loving in this spiritual kingdom. And angels apparently know that most people on this earth don't believe that there are houses or any of these things in heaven, but that the things proper to humanity and life on this planet are also spiritually proper. and correspondential, connected in a sense through metaphor, to the variety of life in heaven. And so we'll see things in this world that are actually there and in more abundance there because there's more variety of life, a lot more life than there is on this planet right now. From not only humanity here and what have you, but also aliens, like other humans in Swedenborg's, quote unquote use of that term, on other planets. Because intelligent beings to him, with reflective minds as we do, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, are human in a very image sense between them and God. Like, so they get their humanity from the divine. And all of these people throughout the created universe are in heaven. They, in their diversity, helps draw out its perfection, helps heaven to better exemplify and relate and be an image of, receiver of God and God's qualities. Spiritual angels have more beautiful and more extensive homes than those on this planet. That makes sense. It's heaven for the most part. And where there are concentrations of people, the houses are adjoining and they share gardens and courtyards with public squares and streets just like on this planet. He also saw palaces there beyond description, although he does describe them a bit. He says the architecture in heaven is mind-blowing. The very essence of art is there. Oh, welcome. You're going to have to let me know how to say your name, Grace Cycle. Yeah, our book discussions, we don't have as many people interacting in our chat, unfortunately. I wish more people did. But it's nice because I see the views and people seem to like watching it. So maybe you just like me talking about it, folks. That's fine. But if you ever want to join in and share your thoughts, please do. And I will be sure to include more and more general discussions going forward because I know, that draws your conversations with me. And guess what? I love to hear from you. So, welcome. What do you think about this book if you've checked it out? What do you think about these talks? I appreciate your thoughts earlier in the chat as well in some of our videos. So thanks and welcome. And he says, yeah, the architecture there is mind-blowing because the very essence of art is there. What gives forth to art here, even our conception or our gravity towards art, is in heaven. And they say in heaven that these things delight our minds more than our eyes, actually, because we see the deep truths, the divine nature, God in this art form, and all these architecture details and the things around us. So we're not only delighted in the way that humanity often is in this world, but we're delighted super deeply because it connects with our minds in a way that opens up the divine to us. And even all the objects around the house correspond to the deeper qualities that these angels, these people, receive from God in this spiritual world. And in general, houses correspond to the good that occupies its occupants, and the things within it to the things that make up that goodness, kind of the details of it. And the things outside of it refer to true things that come from the good things, the goodness that the house represents and the things within it represent more in detail. And it also experiences a perception and recognition, cognition of those people. It's almost like your life is manifest around you. It would be kind of amazing because there would be this echo, right, within, without, in our connection with divinity. It would be transcendent. It would almost be overwhelming, and from my point of view, and as he says, it's beyond our comprehension in this world. And goodness and truth also relate to their love. So all these things relate to their loves, their wisdom, intelligence, etc. So sounds like every manifestation, from bodies to clothes to houses, have some relation to these folks in our lives. And this is why the Lord calls himself, herself, a temple in Scripture, according to Swedenborg. And why the New Jerusalem is described as being so splendid, with jasper and gold in the streets, with gates on each side for all these diverse people to enter. Like, these descriptions of cities in Scripture and temples, and how God, what God even calls him or herself, relate to the deep meaning of these structures. We're housed by our goodness. We're protected by it. We're kept in life. We have our life in it. We create families. We have abundance by living in our goodness, by the goodness that we receive from God. And these deep metaphors, for me, really connect. Well, thank you, Grycycle. It's nice to have you. I'm glad I said it right. Cool. So, what do you think? I just had a error. I hope you all can still hear me. I'm gonna check for a second. Hello, I'm having to switch to an alternate sound. Can you hear me now? Let me know in the chat. See. Yeah, you lost me before. I heard a phone like sign that things had errored. So hopefully you can hear me now. My backup. It's good to have a backup, folks. I probably need 2 more, but beyond my capabilities at this point. Thank you for your patience. And so, yeah, this is why all these things in Scripture are related that way, and it just makes sense to me. Angels of the deeper heaven largely live in loftier places like mountains. Spiritual angels live in hilly areas, I guess relating to kind of the representation of even, how high things go in the spiritual realm. Higher, the more inner, the closer to God, kind of everything is correspondential there. And in those in the natural heavens, the spiritual natural and the heavenly natural, those areas look like rocky cliffs. And he says, quote, "This is why mountains in the word mean heavenly love, hills mean spiritual love, and rocks mean faith." Interesting. So I guess if you're reading Scripture, what you're looking for is what do these things correlate to, and why? What's it trying to tell me about, Abraham woke up early in the morning and started climbing the mountain, things like that. It's like a representation of state, changes of state, and kind of the overall journey of human spirituality, not in the historical sense, but in each of our lives. It's trying to speak to us and draw us into the same type of traveling, the same type of insight and relation. Houses are also given by the Lord gratis. So, it sounds like a really amazing society where there's a lot of abundance and people not only share things with each other, but they're given so much from God. And these houses also change depending on the people's state, but slightly, he says, over time. And he says whatever angels possess, they attribute to the Lord. So in a sense, even in this world where we think we earn everything, it's actually from God. It's from God in our life, God in our strength, God in the structures around us, the wisdom and goodness within them that give them life and ability to connect and to make greater structures, for greater connection, for greater abundance, and variety, really. And anything these angels need, he says, is given to them. Wow. I think in this world we actually have so much abundance, we could do this. But some of us hoard billions of dollars of cash, right? It's the trickle-down economics is more like trickle from all the people making things down to people who are super rich. I mean, it's true. People make all kinds of wonderful things in this world. In fact, profits are at an all-time high, or at least they were, and yet wages are stagnant. It's not a just equation. We could still be capitalists and pay people more equitably if that's what we were interested in. And in a sense, we're only semi-capitalists, even in this society, because we have a lot of socialist institutions. Our streets, our firefighters, our police, our military, actually all the things that often people who say they don't like socialism like are actually socialist enterprises because they're paid for by the community at large, and they serve all of us. And we can do this with food too. We can do this with housing, as we have in the past. And I think if we really lean into our abundance, we would see it for what it is. That's my 2 cents. Now back to Swedenborg. I'm curious what your 2 cents is. What is your position on economics and how we share things in this society? And do you think there's room to grow, no matter how much you disagree with me? Like, whatever your position is, how would you grow from here? What steps can we take? And how would they benefit community at large, and protect people, bring them safety, and not just pure anarchy? I won't have it. No, I'm kidding. You can say that too. So the next section is called Space in Heaven. Angels have no notion of space, just like time, as Swedenborg said. Although everything there appears in relation to space, in relation to each other. There are distances, it seems. But actually all motion in heaven and distance is due to difference of state. Distance of state. And actually, you move near each other the more you're like in state, and you move away from each other in dissimilarity, which that kind of makes sense. I think we use that kind of wordage, at least, in our vocabulary and the way we talk about people, especially when we talk about our internal lives. Like, I feel you're really far from me right now. You can't hear me. Things like that, right? Greicycle asks, are the correspondences anything like Platonic forms, do you think? Yeah, I think so. I think actually Swedenborg talks about Platonic forms and kind of these essential symbols and forms as relating to this understanding of correspondences that Pluto and other sages of the past had this understanding of. And I don't know, I think that's who came up with it, he could correct me. But that they had this understanding of these deep metaphors. In fact, the Greeks did, and actually a lot of the huge symbols and even mythological wisdom in our history is due just to kind of a natural disposition to understanding that there are deep metaphors and symbols around us and that these things represent deeper things. In fact, Pegasus, for example, a horse with wings, represents like wisdom and how it helps you to fly. And Swedenborg talks about wisdom in scripture relating to horses because they carry you, they move you forward at a high speed, they help you progress, right? And thanks for the question, great question. Let me know if you have another one on that. I'll reflect on it too and get back to you. I may feel like I didn't quite answer it. You also say, I think Swedenborg says, our spirit is always on the other side and here on earth when we are. Yeah, I've heard that too. I've read that. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, our spirit's also in the spiritual realm. And he talks about it really kind of being in that middle state, but in relation to these spirits that are connected to heaven and hell. And some of us lean more towards heavenly community, some of us more towards hellish. But we can have a connection with multiple at a time. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. I think even more in the next, chat that we have. But I think that he also talks about how our spiritual bodies appear in different places. Like they almost... and without really awareness that it's there. So sometimes we're relating to people, but really often we're almost too occupied with the physical realm. And he says it wasn't always like that, but we'll get to that. Yeah, the hoarding bugs you too. That's awesome. Yes, it is. It's just hoarding. It's another type of hoarding, but we came up with nice caves to hide the cash in, Back in the day when a village came up with a way to make everything better, it wasn't just the manager or the person who came up with it who took the profit from that and was like, oh man, I made it, finally. Let's look at how such a great manager I was, or how such a great, manager my grandfather was, right? It actually went to the body of those people because it's abundance for all. In fact, it should be. And Swedenborg also talks about how in the heavenly realms, that's what they're all oriented towards, is giving all that they have of value to each other and actually not focusing on themselves. And to the extent that they do that, that kind of leveraging between the two, the more they receive of heaven. And as communities, that's true as well in heaven. So thank you. Great detail and great reflection. And you say, I think this is a new Gilded Age, like the 1920s. The way we deal with it is in demonstrating our goodness in our daily lives. Yeah, I think we are more becoming that, especially because we're keeping track of everything we do and we're expressing the things that we output. But often it can be from a selfish state, right? We can kind of present all these wonderful, output and all this wonderful, processing externally, but often we can do it from kind of a self-focused state. And we're all tasked, each of us, to give up more and more of that selfishness and continue to do the good things, and especially to help people more, and to really reflect on how we're doing it, and if it's really good and really helping people. Really uplifting justice, for the marginalized, for the stepped upon. That's the real calling, that's goodness, because that's increasing the life within them, their ability to receive heaven within, without, in their lives now. That's true usefulness, right? It lasts for eternity, because especially when we help people take care of their everyday things, including their wisdom and other things too, it allows them to focus on those deeper things because they're not starving, right? So yeah, good point. And the parable of the cave, you say, you think this came about in the early church when people talked about direct visions of this afterlife. Oh yeah, you're relating what we talked about earlier to the parable of the cave. Yeah, I think so too. Nice. We should read more about the parable of the cave. I've heard it a few times about, we're all watching kind of the shapes, the shadows that we cast in the cave, but then, we turn around and we realize, oh wait, there's all this life happening, and it's a famous parable from Pluto. Is that right? And whoever it's from, it's famous from a sage, and it kind of relates to, okay, here's this material realm, and we think everything here is really the best and all there is, but actually there's something even deeper and transcendental going on at the same time, giving forth to all that's great here. It's not that we can't see or say that it's great, but that, the more we really value things for how they serve people's hearts, how they serve people's lives and insight, the more we can grow, the more we can increase joy. And in fact, it brings peace itself. And we'll get to that pretty soon. Let's keep moving. All right, so moving away, it's like dissimilarity. Moving closer is when you're more similar. And this is why communities have similar states and why hell is so separated from heaven, because the states are so different in hell. In fact, inverse, right? And angels get to places more quickly if they're eager to get there, kind of like how it feels here, right? And they also appear near each other if they are agreeing or want to see each other. And they may disappear if that stops or if not. So trippy. It's like quantum reality, but made with like human bodies and like objects. It's almost like, I don't know. I see a lot of the things that are happening here in our physics and the, kind of the smallest scale, kind of the magical, the spookiness, as Einstein says it, of like quantum physics. And also, weirdly enough, in our most external scale, which is like technology. People can appear to each other if we want to, right? FaceTime, what have you, Skype, and communicate. It's interesting. Maybe we should lean into his visions of heaven to come up with like the next device. We'll start filling each other. I think, didn't Apple try to do that where you could like fill like the type of taps that people did? They called it, I forget what they call it. Someone help me out. But anyway, moving on. This is like the state of our minds, haptic feedback, but like with touch. Anyway, it's kind of amazing. This is like the state of our minds and thoughts, which to us is the void of space and where things appear if we focus intently on them. And why places in space and the Word and Scripture of all its different forms, not just the books of the Bible that Swedenborg thought were the Word, mean matters that involve state, from distances to paths to fields, cities, and lengths, breadths, heights. And that's why Scripture, biblical Scripture, specifically in my history, I know, speak of these things. And he says it's because of these correspondences. When it's talking about the height, breadth, and width of the holy city, and it gives like a very detailed number, 144,000 cubits, it means something. It's 12 by 12, and 12 means like the whole complex of truth of good and goodness, like knowledges of things. And that's the gates. And you have to enter through knowledges to go into the city and start living goodness. Although it's really your heart that leads, but often it's truth that helps get us get us to actually do it, to really look at our lives. And it's that insight that allows us to change, because we realize, hey, I'm not living in the New Jerusalem. I'm outside of it. Let me walk through a gate. Apparently, these things, this length, breadth, correspondent states of goodness, truth, and their difference in regard to level is height, which is their meaning when they show up in Scripture. Interesting. The next section is called Heaven's Form, which determines how people associate and communicate there. Before I delve into that, I want to turn back to our chat. See, Grycycle says he's changed just in the past 3 months or so. That's wonderful. That's great to hear. I find I am received much better now. Oh, that's beautiful. And basically because of Swedenborg. Wow. Really good insight into your life and into your living, and your heart has been transformed by God through some wisdom, through some insight, and your willingness to change, to accept that better living from divinity. That's beautiful. Thank you. And you find it really exciting. Me too. Thank you. That's wonderful. And you say consciousness is non-local, according to Deepak Chopra. He calls it quantum reality. Oh, I should read more Deepak. We're on the same page there. That's awesome. Thank you. Great insight. Appreciate your thoughts. Keep sharing them as we go along. So we talked about heaven being a macrocosm of the microcosm that are angels, and the macrocosm that's God. So like everything's kind of a hologram of itself in a sense. Angels, communities, the human form, even, at least in the material descriptions of the human form, it's like correspondentially, but the human form as a spirit is that microcosm of God. And we are created in the image of heaven and in this world, the inner of heaven, image of heaven, and the outer of this world. Although the world is also full of correspondences, but we're not in the image of it. We may be correspondential to the things of heaven, but we're not quite in the image of it. We don't become super beautiful, the more we receive good in our lives. Although, healthy habits do help us make, look better often. So there's a little bit of correspondence there, right? However, to the extent we are caught up in evils, destructive selfishness and the like, no matter your tradition or not, we destroy the image of heaven within us, and we try to, and we create an image of hell in our spirits. So even though we're made to be like this, we can decide not to, and we continue to make those choices and orient our affections that way. And that leads to unpleasantness and unhappiness, ultimately, even if we seem to be caught up in the pleasures of our evil. And we should allow the Lord to work on continuing to restore the image of heaven with us. In fact, that's what Scripture is for. That's why God speaks to us through different words in all communities, even in heaven, as we'll talk about. And use this insight from our lives, even from our experiences, from connecting with each other, from Instagram, right? To dispel the image of hell in our lives. To communicate with and reap the benefits and joys of heaven actively, and its love, its intelligence, and its wisdom. And so each angel and community receives these things, and how much they accept it within themselves, the form of heaven in a sense, determines how they relate to and communicate with each other. So there's still like a variety of how they relate to each other, even in communities and between communities, although they're all trying to share the joys that they have. It's received differently, it's communicated differently, depending on their bit. It makes sense. And he talks earlier about how this is done partly through auras. So apparently in the spiritual realm, auras really exist. I guess some people were onto something there. And he says all heaven's communities are united ultimately by the Lord, by a direct and indirect inflow. So both you have that personal relationship with God, also indirectly, and the indirect flow being through other people, through angels or aliens, I want to say, in angelic communities. So there you go. And really what you're oriented there isn't the differences of where, what you're concerned about isn't the differences of where they came from in the next life, but just how you're relating to them. And that's what shapes what their bodies look like, right? And this connection flows out from the higher heavens to the lower, these connections that are indirect, and not the opposite. as the state of those in the inmost heaven greatly transcends those in the spiritual or second heaven, and kind of like how the spiritual realm gives forth to us, in a sense the heavenly gives forth to the spiritual. But within a level, within the three major levels of orientation, you could say, of heaven, things are shared mutually to a large degree. Forms of government in heaven. All in a community are involved in a similar good, but not in similar wisdom. Thus, governments are necessary so that good order is kept, because not everyone has the same insight at the same time. So there are various forms of government in heaven. One major kind in the heavenly one in the spiritual. And in the spiritual, these governments actually, depend on the particular function of each community within it. So there's actually a lot of variety in the spiritual heaven, especially because, they're more oriented towards wisdom and truth. And because they're not as insightful about the love that comes to them and see wisdom so clearly, they need these different forms. But overall, though, in heaven, there is no government except that of mutual love. So God isn't, dictating a certain overall government except that of mutual love. Interesting. The form of government in the heavenly kingdom is called justice because people there are intent on the good the Lord's love does in and through us, the results of which are called just. This government belongs to the Lord alone, and he leads and teaches them there in matters of life. Although they do gain wisdom from each other, that wisdom ultimately comes from God, and who they learn it from has always, one learned it from God, one step away. And the truths that we associate with judgment are engraved on their hearts. They easily see and grasp them when presented, so they don't dispute on them. They actually perceive if it's real or not, and then they just live it, actually. A government in the spiritual kingdom is called judgment, so justice and judgment. And as you'll see, these relate to terms often repeated in the Hebrew Bible. So my rule will be one of justice and judgment, justice and judgment, justice and judgment. And so that's why I think Swedenborg is saying it appears like that because so often in Scripture, because in a way the meaning of these words describe the two major kingdoms of heaven. And it's called judgment, the spiritual kingdom, as they are intent on the good of thoughtfulness towards the neighbor, which in its essence is truth, and you use truth to judge. What is true is a matter of judgment, he says, and what is good is a matter of justice. These angels are led by the Lord indirectly, and so they have officials and laws that help direct them. And all of this is what is meant when judgment and justice is mentioned in Scripture, and describing the Lord's church and heaven. And the communities of the spiritual kingdom vary depending on its function. And these are generally parallel to the functions of the human body, although more perfect in form. With that, I want to reconnect with those in the chat. See. So, Greicycle, you say, I think the Jewish priests in the pre-rabbinic era probably invented the one God, probably due to ultra-real near-death experiences from other Jews. Yeah, they were probably really connected with that. And maybe there was like a remnant from the early humanity. There's a remnant of a one God. I was watching this series with Morgan Freeman. What's it called? It's God something about, he goes and interviews people about their beliefs in God, and there's a different topic every episode. Although, as I've heard from him in interviews, he doesn't believe in God or afterlife at all. But it's interesting because in one of them, he's visiting Egypt, and they're saying, this is one of the first markers of monotheism, is in a specific age in Egypt. But then it's upended pretty quickly. So yeah, it's interesting. I bet near-death experiences would really give insight to that. That's cool. Good point. And you said if you're interested, the Chopra full audiobook called Life After Death is on YouTube. Listen to the whole thing. Awesome. We do get through a lot in these talks, and I can understand why people shy away from participating during these long book discussions, but hey, it's quicker than reading it, and we get more personal insight from people. I really do I cut to what I think is really helpful, but often examples help. A little bit more reflection on these topics help. It can be hard to go through this so quickly, So I recommend downloading the book, which you can find in the links near this podcast or video, also on Swedenborgiancommunity.org. Either if you scroll down on the homepage or on the worship, watch and listen page, or in Explore, the Explore and Learn. We have a bunch of other Swedenborg books there too, so you can download a lot of free books on our website. Who knew? Yeah, so that's great. And you say you now read people's auras in a much more compassionate way because of Swedenborg. That's great. Yeah, you're interpreting things more positively because your heart has been changed by wisdom that Swedenborg helped relay, by the Lord, by the lady in your life. That's wonderful. And you suspect most people sort of go towards heaven simply because they're not very interested maybe in hell. At least in modern society, I like it. Yeah, that's so positive. I think so too. I think we're all leaning more towards heaven. I hope so for myself. Definitely think you all are. I see it in your beautiful examples. Thank you so much, Grace Cycle. I appreciate your deep wisdom. Alyssa says it's interesting that there is in fact a need for government even in heaven. That justice is a vital part of a heavenly community that perfectly reflects their needs. Yeah, it is interesting. It's interesting that he says, in a sense, government in his terminology, because he says the overall government is mutual love. So in a way he's saying, he's using the term government to mean, how do things relate to each other? How does divine wisdom connect people, and how does this work? Because most of us would, if we said, tomorrow, let's change our government, whatever your country is, into the government of mutual love. No rules, no laws, no whatever. That wouldn't quite fly, right? But he says, that, so it's not really like government in that sense on the big scale, but yes, there are governments in these heavenly kingdoms, the spiritual kingdoms especially. In that kingdom, there's the form of governments that we would call government, with officials and laws. And that's because, they're not as oriented towards justice like those in heavenly. They're more towards judgment. It takes them some time to find justice, to find how best to live it. Although there's a lot more insight there than here, and it's still perfect. It's still an image of God. So the process is working there, and they're moving forward. I'm sure it'll blow our minds, as Swedenborg says, how great it's doing. We would probably find it, do you really need the government? You're all so amazing, right? But Swedenborg saying, the divine wisdom and truth go so deeply, it could be nice to have these officials even in this kind of heavenly spiritual state. It's fascinating, good point. Beyond my comprehension, I just try to riff on it, right? Thanks. All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot, Alyssa, for that reflection and opinion. And so these forums still share a central focus, according to Swedenborg, which is for the public good, and within that, the good of each person. And to the extent each angel gets on board with this focus is the extent that they are receiving love of the Lord and benefiting from it. So to the extent that they're really getting on board with kind of the focus of these governments, even the personal government that you kind of employ with your own intentionality and actions, the more heavenly you are, the more heaven you receive, the more joy. And officials in that spiritual kingdom are those who more than others enjoy love and wisdom, and therefore wish well to everyone, and from that know how to make sure it happens. They don't control and command, but minister and serve out of love for that. They make themselves less important than others, not more so. But, as we learned earlier, those who rule tend to have more splendid, palaces, and it's kind of strange, especially with those in the heavenly kingdom not having that. But I think it's because of this orientation towards, okay, we're still judgment in this judgment state, not judgmental in like a hellish state, but we're still kind of discerning, and we need these markers, we need this beauty to draw us forward more towards love of God's qualities in the way that the heavenly kingdom is, right? And however they receive respect in a center position in the community, in that abode that I was talking about, because of their internal state being more receptive of God, and they accept these for the sake of obedience. The fact that they are gifts and how these gifts serve other people. So they're doing it partly for the marker of their leadership, so that they're taken seriously, so that they're good intentions and their ability to get things done is taken seriously and happens. Which, as we know in this world, our leaders aren't automatically the best leaders, right? So it's kind of amazing there. Hell, on the other hand, has forms of government too, to keep them in restraint from hurting each other all the time. But these forms are opposite of those in the heavens, as they derive from selfishness. All their want. So in a sense, like, it's interesting because Swedenborg is saying, like, heaven, hell, they all have governments, and hell is allowed a government. In fact, has like a propensity to it, also for their benefit, to help restrain them from hurting each other. It's kind of amazing in that regard. But they still make their government in the form of their selfishness. And he says all there want to control others and be preeminent, and they hate those who disagree with them. And the most vicious there hold office and are obeyed by fear, through fear. Makes sense. That makes sense for hellish communities, as often happens even in our own lives. We can try to control through domination and fear, and that's quite hellish for us and for others. Divine worship in heaven is the next section. So we're stepping away from hell again, just a little toe into the hellish realm, back to heaven, and of course he goes, much more in detail of hell later at the end of the book. Worship in heaven is similar to that on earth, in all its variety. There are even buildings that vary based on the community. Sermons, discussions happen there, so that angels are continually perfected in wisdom and love. So there's still sharing of wisdom. But their essential worship is that of love, thoughtfulness, and faith. Nothing is considered holy there just because it looks that way or because it's been called that. It has to have within it something good, and it has to be leading itself towards better living. It has to be, useful in that way, a tool leading people to better living. And that's what's considered holy, not its form. Otherwise, it may mimic holiness, apparently, according to Swedenborg, but it is hypocritical and deceptive and not really of heaven. Preachers of heaven are all from the spiritual heaven, not the heavenly, because preachers are more attuned to truths and saying things about them, preaching them, whereas heavenly angels perceive them when they hear them, when they enter their lives, and they put them into act. They don't talk about them, they just live them forward. However, heavenly angels still attend sermons and talks. And in the past I've heard someone say that that's spiritual angels who give those sermons, but in this reading I didn't see that. I'm curious, maybe it's just like people from community. Maybe a different person in the community gives a sermon, when it's needed, or a talk. That makes sense too, right? As we see in our world around us, it's not all preachers, but people share a lot of wisdom and deep insight through talks, through posts, through preaching, through etc. in all these different ways. Now, all sermons and their doctrine in heaven focus on life and not faith apart from life and love. The doctrines that inform their preaching, so inform their talks, are suited for the grasp of angels in each heaven and are focused on this deep love of God's qualities. And the essential of all doctrine there, so the doctrine kind of depends on the community, but the essential of it all is a recognition of the divine's humanity, like life, like God's personhood, and a presence with all people. The next section is called the power of heaven's angels. So personal power comes from our volition and intellect, even in this world, according to Swedenborg, at least in its core. And that is our spiritual personhood. And this we receive from God. It's a gift. And it comes from an inflow from heaven as well. So angels have power that actually would strain our belief, and they're able to upend environments and disperse evil spirits if needed, hundreds of them. And vast amounts of spirits bent on evil are powerless against angels and their skills, actually. And their skills and wiles, the evil spirits, amount to nothing against angels who see their machinations and dispel them instantly. This power also exists with angels in the physical realm when God grants it to them. This is why angels are called powers and powerful in Scripture, in biblical Scripture. as well as others, I'm sure. Of course, all their power comes from the Divine One in divine truth, which is why they credit themselves with nothing, which actually allows them to receive that power and to maintain it and to receive more. And each angel receives power and divine truth to the extent that they are open to divine good, which is love. Truths apart from good have no power, and vice versa. Deliberate distortions have no power against truth and goodness in the spiritual realm as well. So that is the power of angels. It's from their deep wisdom and reception of God. Chrysacle says that 3 months ago he planned to convert to Judaism or to be an atheist, like a lot of people now. Yeah, I was once an atheist, Chrysacle. But Swedenborg thing is great. That's great. Awesome. Your soul needs help in heaven planning your next time-based reincarnation, some say. Yeah, first I want to go back to that last statement. Wow, that's amazing. That you've been inspired by Swedenborg so much. I'm sure, I know Jewish people have great insight and wisdom, and, but, each of us, we find our truths in different places and from multiple places. And it's so cool that I really have found a lot of wisdom, deep wisdom in Swedenborg as well that I didn't find in most religions, and from my point of view, growing up. And I heard a lot of religious talk. So, we each find our own wisdom, hopefully, and hopefully it leads us to connect with divinity and love and community more and more and in more and more wisdom. Thank you. That's amazing. Yeah, so you're saying your soul needs help in heaven planning your next time-based reincarnation. Yeah, maybe reincarnation exists. Swedenborg says it doesn't, but it could exist. I can see a lot of what people say happens in reincarnation happening in Swedenborg's descriptions of like processing in heaven and changes of state and even bodies changing, right? Like, in a way, it's like an image of each other. So it's kind of cool in that way. And in fact, in that same series that Morgan Freeman leads, someone will have to look it up for me, The Story of God, I think it's called. He talks to Hindu folks who talk about their reincarnation and how it helps lead them to this better and better life. And it also informs their life that they need to look at their heart and change in this life. I mean, that's what Swedenborg does for me. So there you go. I think it's a key thing, and it's so helpful for the people around us, as you were saying earlier, because our impact on them is improved. We're not so selfish, and I know that's been true in my life too. I can really relate with you there. You also say, some say there is only love and fear here on earth, but God is only love. We can always choose love too. Yeah, some people say there's either love and fear, you're saying, here on earth. Yeah, there's like the dichotomy of love and fear. I think that too. You can call kind of the opposite of love fear. And like there's a deep fear in the heart of selfishness and destruction, and that could even be the source in a sense. This kind of orientation to the opposite of love. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's heaven and hell, really, right? That's what brings the apparent dichotomy of heaven and hell. Yeah, and that's something we cover in depth in the first video in other terms, and I really like the way you put it, love and fear. The language of angels is our next subject. Angels talk much like we do, similar things, but more intelligently, from a deeper level of thought. Angels make sound from their throats and mouths. They still have those things, which permeates their spiritual atmosphere, like in ours. They also understand, they all understand each other. So that's cool. Although their language and its sounds vary by their affections and thoughts. Thus, angels know just from the speech of people, what kind of a person they are. With wiser angels knowing from a few statements what someone's ruling affection is, especially from their tone, since this is what they are primarily attentive to. Since angels' spiritual language corresponds to affection of love for the Lord and our neighbor, their language is extremely elegant and delightful. So they get their language from their affection of love for God and each other, qualities of God, and so that makes their language elegant because it responds to that. It corresponds to that even. It also is so full of wisdom that they can express in a single word what we cannot say in 1,000. And their thinking can encompass things we cannot grasp at all. Their individual ideas give rise to their words, and their affections give rise to their tones. Okay, I can see that. Tone being affectional, which also corresponds to variations of heat, heavens, light, and warmth. And unlike our language and how we sound, theirs corresponds perfectly with their affection and their mind. So it fits them perfectly. And the individual ideas of anyone can be presented in heaven's light when it pleases God. So it can actually be formed in an image, not just through language. And there's also language of facial expressions in heaven, of body movements. So there's like a dance language, as we have here, right? But maybe even more in-depth and broad. And a language in which images are combined with concepts and presented visually. That makes sense, like PowerPoint. Any image really, right? And the language of shared affections and of shared thoughts, and on. So there's like, it's almost like, opening your mind to someone and having telepathy. Wow. I knew there was a source for all the things in our books and movies here. Maybe it happens here too, right? Especially if we're attuned to that kind of thing. You also, Greicycle, you also say, a lot of Christianity seems riddled with pretty serious errors, according to Swedenborg. Swedenborg is very spiritual, which I actually think is much better. Or you didn't say according to Swedenborg, but you said errors. Yeah. I mean, they could say we're full of errors, or I'm full of errors for believing in things like this, but Swedenborg would say, that being oriented towards faith alone is not what Scripture says. So he would say it's not actually Christianity that's distorted, but actually how Christians have come and reinterpreted it, and also, said everyone else is going to hell, things like that. And so in a sense, it's like Christianity is right on, because he would define Christianity as being right on. But yeah, you're right, like the way Christianity describes certain ideas, especially in like the dogma of a lot of churches, not always the people of those churches, can be really distorted and be really selfish and say, okay, you just believe in this, doesn't matter your heart, just believe in this historical figure and you're set, and you get to heaven. And Swedenborg would say, no, you have to let heaven into your heart. And it starts in your heart. It has to really change how you live and feel and are motivated. Otherwise it gets nowhere. Otherwise you think you believe and you don't really. Greicycle, you also share, if you listen deeply and find and kind of fearlessness, it kind of blows people away. If you listen deeply and in fearlessness, it blows people away because they don't really expect it much today. Yeah, it's nice to listen to people and try to really be present with them and be fearless about it. It can be hard. It can be hard to do that, and it's a process to get better at that and to really like meet people where they are and uplift them, right? Because you have to meet them where they are to be able to uplift them, because otherwise you're like trying to force your image onto them. Not really going to get you anywhere. It's nice to share wisdom, some deep insights about how things work, and Swedenborg, and maybe even personal things, because we can relate. But if you're going to force it, if you're going to say this is how you believe, or you should believe, and be dogmatic about it, that doesn't really get you anywhere. All right, so hellish and evil spirits also have language that relates to their affections, but because it relates to their affections, angels find it really repulsive to listen to and distorted, filled with foul concepts and things against and opposite of heavenly loves and languages. And hypocrites apparently can also imitate angelic language in the spiritual realm, but only their words seem angelic. Wiser angels can see past the words and hear in their affection their heart, their orientation, and so they can be revealed in the spiritual realm. So how angels talk with us. Angels speak to us in our language with words from our vocabulary, since they unite to us when they communicate with us. They can't do it any other way. They have to unite with us and do it in our language. When they do this, they also unite with our memory, and they perceive it as their own. And spirits in the realm between heaven and hell, called the world of spirits, where people are still processing and getting ready for one or the other, choosing one or the other, can also unite to us, but they like to think that their memories, our memories, are theirs, and that our speech comes from them, to the extent that they're aware of it, because they tend to still be more selfish before kind of moving on. Interesting, huh? Angels and spirits unite us because we have separated ourselves from heaven. If we haven't done this throughout the course of our history, we would be governed by the Lord through a general inflow from heaven without having angels and spirits assigned to us. So we don't need these spirits assigned to us. We would actually just have a general inflow from heaven, our connection with God. But more on this later, he says. Now, when these are allowed to speak to us, these angels, it sounds audible, and spirits, although others cannot hear them. Huh, interesting. This is rarely allowed nowadays since it's dangerous. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, does that sound like craziness to you all, to hear languages or hear people talking to you? And do you believe that that's actually possible? I'm curious. In general, spirits aren't informed that they are connected to beings still in the physical realm. Yeah, so these types of real kind of, okay, the spirit's talking to me, situations don't happen that often anymore. Now, conversations with angels aren't allowed for people except with those focused on truths that flow from really good intent in their hearts, and those that have their deeper levels opened by divine truths all the way to the Lord. And people who talk with angels see heaven, actually, and angels see this world through them often. So kind of the realms are open for people whose hearts are really transformed and they're focused on good intent. And the Lord allows it. And the earliest humans had this type of union with angels. But since then, humanity has moved more towards love of ourselves than the Lord and toward love of the world over heaven. And so we lost that connection. And angels can communicate with us from a great spiritual distance. They don't have to be right next to us. As well as many angels at once through an envoy. And no angel or spirit can currently speak to us from their memory, but only through ours. Although apparently in the past that had happened, but led to some destructive relationships. There are also spirits who unite to our bodies and take over our senses and possess people, but these are now in hell and held there by the Lord, according to Swedenborg, and this type of possession no longer occurs. This is the 18th century, maybe it occurs again. Who knows? Yeah. Written materials in heaven, there are written materials in heaven. This is mainly in order to share wisdom with each other, divine truth, the word, as it manifests differently in each community. Funny enough. And the word is spoken by the Lord, and it is filtered through each heavenly community, and it lands in each one in different shapes, different guises. Who knew, right? God speaks to us in all these different ways in each community, depending on our needs and how we're shaped. And writing of heaven expresses heavenly wisdom and affections in its shapes and structures. So you even see kind of divine attributes in the shapes of writing, although that of the spiritual heaven is more like ours because it's a little bit more natural, less loving, less closer to God. And numbers in heaven exist too, but represent general things, general ideas and subjects, whereas words, more specific ones. Thus, numerical writing unfolds more wisdom and mysteries than alphabetical. Interesting. So numbers can have like this kind of general meanings. So they, in a way, they have to hold mysteries because the general meaning doesn't really tell you all its details unless you really delve into it, right? Greicycle shares, if you listen deeply and kind of fearlessly, it kind of blows people away, yes. I want to reiterate that even though I accidentally read it. It does. We should all do that. But you also mentioned damnation, which doesn't exist according to rabbis, but can be present, I think you're saying. Hell can be present. As soon as you listen closely, your sense of humor kicks in. It's kind of amazing. Yeah. Yeah, you get more joy out of caring about people a little more, leaning into that practice, that caring, hearing practice, really listening practice. And you get ideas in the gap between sleeping and waking. Oh, cool. Swedenborg talks about that kind of thing. And other people do too. It's like the hypnagogic state. I could be saying it wrong, but I think that's the word. That kind of middle state. You can see things and trip a little bit and learn things, get ideas. That's amazing that you do. Yeah, someone else mentioned this too. Cool. And I think most people don't go towards hell for obvious reasons. Great. Yeah. I think it does. I think it is obvious, but I don't know if it's obvious for all of us. There is a lot of hellishness in this world, a lot of selfishness. I think it does take a little optimism. My sermon for Sunday is on hope, and a hope even in the darkness. And I think often that's what we have to have. And often it appears even in the darkest people, the darkest times. And we should lean into that hope. We should invite it. Often we can't get rid of our most heinous leaders. We should actually, to the extent that they have an idea that could help people, of course, we should promote it if we can't replace them. Right? And same with ourselves, though, because we can be in a lot of selfish states and a lot of dark states. And there can be hope that comes, and I think there is hope, and we just have to listen for it, lean into it, and appreciate it when it comes, have gratitude for it and towards it. Thank you, Grace Cycle. The Wisdom of Heaven's Angels is one of our last sections from our reading this time. So the wisdom of heaven's angels far transcends our own, of course. No comparison, beyond comprehension. This is thanks to their direct connection and informing from heaven's light and heat, which is wisdom and love itself, truth, intellect, and goodness itself. As well as all their thoughts and affections flowing in accordance to the heavenly form. And there's nothing really that draws them away from the divine inflow. They have their oscillations, but they're always in heaven. Like they're still moving and they're still growing. Their speech and writing also flow directly from their thought and can be said to be the language of wisdom. Their thoughts are also not bounded by concepts from space and time, which distract us here on earth from spiritual things and intellectual sight, and as they are properties of nature. And when we get too bogged down in nature without looking for the deeper meaning of nature, just the details, the formulas, without really looking for why and what does it mean for us in our lives, it draws us away, it distracts us from these deeper concepts, which actually ends up misinforming our hearts often because we get caught up in too worldly cares. They are also in heaven not distracted by worldly cares as they receive everything free. Oh, that helps. That's nice. And even receive joys and pleasures in proportion to the reception of God's wisdom. I think it's nice that they receive these things and these benefits for free. And I think especially in this world, like we could really benefit from doing that with mental illness. We used to have a lot more institutions that help people with their mental problems. It hurts us to not help those people for free. I think it's crazy. There's a lot of other examples. I think it's even the examples people don't agree on for me, I think also fall into that, but we don't have to talk about that now. And those in heaven also share their intelligence and wisdom with others. Everyone shares everything of value, which stems from their love of wanting everything they own to belong to others, which is the basis of heavenly happiness and heaven's happiness. And they can express boundless information in just a word or two, unlike our languages. And so their wisdom, compared to ours, of most in heaven, is like 10,000 to 1. Amazing, right? The key reason they are so wise, according to Swedenborg, especially in divine matters, is because they are free of any selfishness that's been put aside. And that's why they can receive such deep divine wisdom. And those free of selfishness turn their faces to the Lord, their spiritual faces. Thus all angels face the Lord even when they're facing each other and moving about their communities. Trippy, I guess. I mean, I'm guessing that's the spiritual sun. I know he says in another place the spiritual sun's always in front of them if they are oriented that way, in love and wisdom, even when they're like facing each other. Quite fantastical quantum, as Deepak Chopra may say. Angels' wisdom is constantly being perfected into eternity and still will never compare nor form a ratio with the Lord's divine wisdom. There is no ratio between a finite and the infinite. Doesn't matter how much you grow. You can be the best in your community or think you are. You can receive wisdom and grow forever and on. But you're always in a specific present moment, and it's always finite, and that over the infinite is nothing. That's how wise God is, but also that's the joy of our future journey. As Greicycle so gracefully and beautifully put, we think most of the people on this world are hopefully gravitating towards heaven, and I know heaven is trying to make that the reality. The next section is called The State of Innocence of Angels in Heaven. Now, not many people know what innocence is or its quality, according to Swedenborg, except the visible kind in infants, and a little bit that shows in their ignorance and their youth. And we don't know that it's in innocence that heaven is concealed. What does innocence mean to you all? I'm curious, because innocence can have a lot of connotations. I'm sure we'll learn more about what it means to Swedenborg here in a little bit. Swedenborg states that the innocence of infancy or of little ones isn't real innocence because it doesn't go deep enough. It's too outward or shallow, and it's put off as they grow. But it does radiate from their faces and gestures, and it is in connection with heaven. But it's not real because they haven't developed any internal thought, real rational decision making. They can't discern actively between good and evil and like nuance, or especially truth and falsity. I think that's true to a large extent, I guess. But some kids, kids tend to gravitate towards good, according to studies. But I can see that, especially my partner. She works with a lot of kids, and they tend to be very selfish oriented if you're not leading them to better states of orientation. Moreover, their minds aren't formed, which is why their innocence isn't considered stable or real, according to Swedenborg. But there is a state of innocence that passes from heaven to infants, as I mentioned, but the real innocence is an innocence of wisdom because it is internal. It's a property of mind itself, our volition and understanding. And when we have innocence in us, then we have wisdom. Real wisdom, according to Swedenborg. And it is said in heaven, angels have wisdom only as much as they have innocence. People in a state of innocence attribute all that they have that is good and wise to God. And they want to be led by the Lord, and they love Him. They delight in truth and goodness, are content in whatever they have, knowing they have as much as is useful to them. Being content in whatever they have, that's amazing, right? The innocent have no anxiety of the future. No anxiety. Which they say is pain at losing or not getting things that aren't needed for their life's useful activities. Well, they're very receptive of these beautiful truths. I find that quite amazing. They do not collaborate from evil, only from goodness, fairness, and honesty. Since they love being led by the Lord primarily, they are kept away from their self-centeredness, kept away from it, and the laity flows in. These are the heavenly angels that when they hear something from God, they immediately perceive it, intend it, and do it. They appear simple, but are utterly wise. Anyone else get some Yoda vibes from this? I get a little Yoda vibes from this description. Regeneration is our process of becoming more like Yoda, becoming more like this, similar to what some may call salvation. We are made more innocent over time, first in our knowledge, then into intelligence from that knowledge, then into wisdom, always hand in hand with innocence, knowing that it's all from God the whole time. But we're not quite to the really deep innocence described before, but as we grow, like we are realizing, okay, this is from God, and we're in hand with innocence in that growth. Wow. Moving to our Chatsy for a moment. Greicycle says, yeah, I suspect humanity is at a turning point soon, don't you? I do. Yeah, I think we're kind of in that shift. We're in hopefully the knee of like this really amazing positive growth. The knee that a lot of like futurists talk about with technology, just taking off. I think that hopefully is true with humanity's hearts. I see that too. Maybe they happen together. I think they can't happen otherwise because like the futurist technical one, like exponential growth and human internal development, because if they don't happen together, I think we destroy ourselves on the other path, right? Yeah, great question. Einstein said we need new ideas just to be able to solve the old problems. Yeah. Children might be close to their last incarnation or soul plan they made to come here. Yeah, I think children are also, they're more connected to kind of that general inflow of heaven. I know Swedenborg says that in another place. And you also say God is all love. The rabbis say this too. And Alyssa shares, the innocence of wisdom feels like a lack of skepticism or uncertainty. I agree. That's great insight. It seems like it would be a state of great peace, always certain of the gifts of God and the goodness and love that fills their spirit. Yes, I think so too. And actually, I think our next section is the peace that comes from all this. So you are right on track, ahead of the game. Very insightful. Thank you for the insight. Yeah, I think it really is. It's leading itself to the state of peace because you're no longer troubled by all this. That's beautiful to me. So we are made innocent over time, as I was describing. And thus, innocence is being led by the Lord and not ourselves. And starting to really realize that we're led by the Lord in our good things and really accept it. And all in heaven are in that innocence. And the Lord being this innocence itself, or the source of it. And to the extent we are in self-centeredness, we don't want this at all. It doesn't sound appealing to us. Those of the inmost heaven are by far the most innocent, on the other hand. And even appear like infants or children to those of the lower heavens, and love this innocence because they know it's the source of their life and their peace, as you were saying, Alyssa, and their joy. This is all why Scripture says we must become like little children to enter heaven, as Jesus says. How else can we interpret that phrase? We have to become like little children to enter heaven. I'm curious. I think there are other interpretations out there. I'm wondering if any of you know of them. Truth can only be united with good in innocence. And this uniting is called the heavenly marriage. So the unition of my heart with my wisdom is a heavenly marriage within me. Wow. And true marriage love between people, so in a marriage, true marriage, also has its source in innocence and the deep engagement of their minds with each other and with God, with God's qualities, which is the source of the childlike and innocent play and interaction that happens in this type of love internally and externally with those people. From all this, we can see that the divine good that comes from God is innocence itself, and is what aligns and transforms angels deep within heaven and each other. This connection between divinity and innocence is why God is described and called the Lamb in Scripture, because the Lamb is, in a sense, an image of innocence. This innocence affects angels so strongly, according to Swedenborg, that when they feel it, they feel as though they aren't in their own control and are moved by such a joy as to be taken out of themselves, so to speak. Wow. And people of hell are absolutely opposed to innocence and don't know what it is being set upon their own self-image and self-love. They ultimately burn with desire and a desire to cause people harm, especially innocent people. And innocence itself. Now, the state of peace in heaven. So, I think our penultimate section, we're almost there, folks. This is a quarter of the book, and all that I think, needs to be highlighted to grasp each section. I hope you get something from it. If I'm too slow, you can speed up the video later on YouTube when it appears. For you watching on YouTube, it's appeared. Or you could slow it down if I talk too fast. It's the beauty of technology, right? So the state of peace in heaven. Heaven's peace, like much else there, is transcendent, and cannot be accepted while we are in our bodies fully. Although there is a peace of mind with people who are content in God. With innocence, peace is the other thing at the heart of heaven that comes directly from God, according to angels. Peace is the heart of the light that comes from innocence, from goodness. Yeah, the heart of joy, because you have peace. It's the source. And the oneness in the Lord between her divine nature and divine humanity gives rise to peace and shows up in heaven through God's union with the angels. Peace is the blessedness of heaven and source of all joy there in that union. Wow. This is why in Scripture the Lord is called the Prince of Peace and the source of peace. And angels are called angels of peace, and heaven the dwelling place of peace. What is peace to you all? I'm curious, because peace can sometimes be nebulous, but I think we all kind of gravitate towards peace. I hope so. Sometimes we can get caught up in things that pull us away and affections that pull us away. Part of us knows that they're not lending to our peace, and I think sometimes that's why we're like, okay, this is really harmful. Let me move on. Let me try to. Let me find help. And I think we should lean into that more. Lean into peace more. It's the source of our joy in life. Despite what we've talked ourselves and machinized, repetited, whatever the word I can make up to describe, how we convince ourselves that these other affections are good and pleasurable. Okay, so peace varies with our reception, of course, of God's hope of union with us, of our union with God. And the Sabbath symbolizes this peace, which is why it was such a holy holiday when it was instituted, and it still is for many, and also symbolizes this peace internally and in our connection with God. And that's why it's quiet and peaceful in its description of kind of what we're supposed to do, or the general gist of what a Sabbath is about. This union that gives forth to this Sabbath, this peace within, is the union of good and truth within us and with God. And it happens primarily after trials by temptation on this world. And then we come into a state of delight from heavenly peace as we overcome our trials. I'll mention that for Swedenborg, Christ was the incarnation of God, Jehovah. He doesn't believe you have to agree or believe that. But he says that Christ glorified, as biblical scripture talks about Christ being glorified but not yet being glorified in some places, through overcoming infinite or unending temptation, all the temptations there were. That's how Christ glorified her humanity and glowed like the sun. I'll remind everyone that, at least in my opinion and in Swedenborg's, God is gender inclusive because we get all these things, this receptive quality, the beauty of everyone from God, and it's through God that things are bountiful, that produce everything of the human body, both genders, aliens, etc., are expressions of God, of correspondences. And God is considered to be gender inclusive, all gender inclusive, according to Swedenborg at least. I'd agree with that. Now, for people who love evil, there is no peace, although they may present outward calm, tranquility, or pleasure. Okay, last section, folks. Let me know your thoughts so far. If you have any other questions, comments. It's been beautiful hearing from you all. Quite the wisdom tonight. I really appreciate it. The next section is called the union of heaven with the human race. There are good and evil spirits with each person, as we mentioned. Our union with heaven is through good spirits, and with hell through evil ones, also angels and God, but mainly through this in our lives here. These are in the world of spirits, which is a realm essentially between heaven and hell, full of people not quite ready. There's processing. So not exactly the Catholic, at least some Catholics' idea of a purgatory, but it is a realm that's not heaven or hell. They do not know that they are with us, these spirits, and when when they're with us, they are fully in our memory, although they do not see the physical realm or us, as we mentioned earlier. We are kept in our own life by evil spirits and restrained from it by the good. So our own life being kind of our propensity towards selfishness and like meism versus the opposite, by the good. And thus kept in the balance that allows us to choose. We would not live if we were restrained entirely from our hereditary and lived evils, our selfishness. And we cannot be compelled to do good because it then doesn't become a part of us. So there has to be freedom. There has to be this whole sphere thing, this whole opposite thing where you can turn your body 360 in a spiritual way and in a globe. That's why evil can exist. It doesn't have to, but human beings have decided to create it. And to the extent we do, it continues to exist temporarily in a sense, because it's nothing in relation to heaven and God. Now, if we don't do good from our own freedom, it actually doesn't become part of us because it's not really our lives. And God is all about our lives and our freedom and the image of God in us, which is fully free to make decisions, all decisions, and God makes all good ones. All ones oriented towards love and wisdom, because God has infinite wisdom and understanding, which gives forth to all things, right? The type of these spirits that are associated with us depends on our affection and love, and they actually change depending on our changes, so they don't always stay the same. And over time, if we are regenerating, the spirits are more and more associated with heaven, or the inner heavens, so more and more connected with the heavenly heaven, the loving, more loving oriented heaven, towards God's qualities. Now, animals are directed by a general inflow from the spiritual world, as we would be, actually, if we weren't born into the type of selfishness that we've been receiving hereditarily. Animals do not have a rational faculty like a human, though, and cannot become evil like we can. Okay. And the Lord controls events through these connections to dispose us to accept heaven more and more through both direct and indirect inflows and providence. Now, heaven's union with us is largely one with the deeper levels of our minds. And if we were to come to accept and believe all this, that the inflows from heaven and hell are what make up and give life to what we think and intend, then we wouldn't accept the evil that we've been receiving and would accept the good as a gift from God. And since we don't believe that fully, and we're leaning into it hopefully, since we don't, we make the evil our own, and we keep it and defile the good with our feelings that we deserve it of ourselves in our selfishness. Wow, that is quite the review of heaven and hell. Thank you all for joining us this evening, connecting with each other and going through this book. I want to turn towards our chassis one more time, see what wisdom we can find there. Greicycle says, I get peace from just being present. But mindfulness, prayer, chanting can work, yeah. Can help, yeah. Like in the morning, say. I use Nichiren Shoshu, Japanese Buddhism, but others use transcendental meditation mantras, yeah. Mantras I've found helpful, yeah. And Buddhism is also, I think, very insightful in terms of how we can kind of lean into these qualities, accept them in our spirit. That's beautiful. Thank you. You also say, my prayer is almost exclusively the gratitude prayer. Yeah, we need to lean into gratitude. We get too caught up what's going wrong, right? And there's so much beauty and gifts around us and within us. I give thanks for things wished, assuming that a solution will present itself in perfect timing. Yeah, and as Swedenborg was saying, even when things are different than what an angel would maybe choose for itself, they say, well, you know what, like God really knows what's useful for me, and I'll accept it and be happy with it as it is. And really the more they do that, the more joyful and peaceful they are, according to Swedenborg. We may or may not disagree. Thank you, that is wonderful, and that is our session 2 of Heaven and Hell, folks. We love reviewing these books together. I understand that getting through so much book is a lot. Doesn't always invite a lot of participation. So maybe we'll put off the third session of this for a while and do some topical things. Maybe go a little deeper into some of the topics that we've covered in these first 2 sessions, and invite more interaction. That's what I'm about. And if anytime you want to call in, you can. We love to hear other people's voices as well. We appreciate you deeply, and go forth knowing that you are quite loved. Bye.